What if the teacher who tried to humiliate him ended up revealing the very brilliance she refused to see? You won't believe how it all unfolded in one classroom. At Jefferson Academy, the walls were always polished, the banners freshly pressed, and the air thick with the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from expectation. In room 204, where music was supposed to fill the air with harmony and inspiration, a different tone often lingered, one that Isaiah Brooks knew all too well. Isaiah was only 13, but his eyes carried years. He had learned early on how to walk quietly, how to keep his voice measured, how to read a room before speaking. That's what it meant to grow up as a young black boy in spaces where you were often seen before you were heard, and usually seen in the wrong light. He sat at the far right corner of the classroom, his fingers gently tapping rhythms on the desk, barely audible but alive. Patterns only he could feel. His own silent rebellion. Music was his language long before he had the words to speak how he felt. The desk was old, the varnish worn, but his tapping danced on it with precision. Across the room, Miss Margaret Tate stood tall and taut, her back ramrod straight, her grey blonde hair pulled tightly into a bun that hadn't shifted in over a decade. Her navy blazer hugged her shoulders sharply. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her authority came from cold glances, clipped words, and a presence that demanded submission. She called roll with mechanical precision, pausing just long enough to add weight to certain names. When she reached Brooks, she didn't say Isaiah. She said Mr. Brooks with a sigh, as if the name itself were a burden to carry. Isaiah didn't flinch. He gave a quiet, "Here, ma'am," eyes fixed on the keys of the worn upright piano across the room. "Mrs." Tate started her lecture, pacing slowly in front of the blackboard. She spoke of Beethoven and Mozart with reverence, the way a pastor might speak of sacred texts. Chalk dust clung to her fingertips as she scrawled their names across the board. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. Then she paused. The kind of pause that made the whole room tighten. She turned to face the class and added, "Of course, I wouldn't expect everyone to appreciate this kind of artistry." Her eyes flicked, ever so briefly, to Isaiah's corner. Some students chuckled under their breath. Not loudly, just enough. Isaiah kept tapping. 1, 2, 3, 4. He knew the game. She didn't have to say it outright, she never did. It was in the way she praised students like Avery Morgan for their natural talent, while telling Isaiah to focus on discipline. It was in the way she always had time to discuss theory with Logan Bennett, but never made space for Isaiah's jazz riffs. To her, he wasn't a student. He was an exception that needed to be contained. Isaiah had been playing piano since he could reach the keys. His grandfather, Derek Brooks, had taught him not just notes and scales, but feel, texture, soul. Late nights at the piano, with old jazz records playing in the background, had been his true education. But Ms. Tate didn't consider that real music. She called it improvisation at best, noise at worst. And yet, Isaiah never let his face show how much it hurt. Because that's what you did when you were like him. You survived by staying composed, Missy. Tate's lecture grew sharper. True musicians, she declared, understand structure. They respect the form. They don't rely on instinct or catchy little tunes. She didn't say Isaiah's name. She didn't have to. Laughter rippled quietly. Not cruel, just complicit. Isaiah's jaw tightened. Not in anger, but in memory. He could still hear his grandfather's voice, gentle but strong. "Son, Music is where we speak when words are too small. Never let anyone decide what's worth hearing. That voice grounded him now, even as Mrs. Tate turned back to the board and muttered, "I doubt the streets of Atlanta put much stock in music theory." Isaiah stayed still. Some of the white students laughed. Others looked down, pretending they didn't hear. The black students kept quiet too. That's what survival looked like. Isaiah swallowed his pride, his rhythm shifting stronger now. 5 beats, then 7, then silence. He could feel it brewing, that need to say something, to rise. But he didn't. Not yet. At home that evening, Isaiah sat at the old upright piano in the corner of their modest living room. The keys were a little uneven, some chipped, but they were home to him. His mother, Naomi Brooks, stood silently in the doorway, arms crossed, her gaze steady. She had seen the signs. The way he came in quiet, the way his fingers hovered over the keys but didn't move. "You know what she's doing, right?" Naomi asked. Isaiah nodded slowly. "She wants me to fail, wants me to prove I don't belong." Naomi walked over and sat beside him. "And what do you want?" He didn't answer right away. Then he whispered, "I just want to be heard. Not corrected. Not tolerated. Just heard." Naomi reached out, placing her hand over his. "Then play, baby." "Not for her, for you, for your grandfather. For the sound that's already living in your chest." Isaiah looked down at the keys. He pressed one, then another. Then the whole room began to breathe again. Isaiah arrived early the next day. The music room was still quiet, the lights a little too bright for the early hour. He slid into his usual seat in the back, the only place in that classroom where he felt invisible enough to breathe. His fingers tapped gently on the desk again, but the rhythm was different today. It wasn't resistance. It wasn't rebellion. It was focus. He had barely gotten 2 measures into the pattern when the door clicked open. Ms. Tate entered with her usual precision, carrying a leather-bound notebook and the air of someone ready for battle. She didn't acknowledge him. She never did, unless it served a purpose. Students began trickling in behind her. Logan Bennett, Chase Taylor, Avery Morgan. A handful of others whose names Isaiah had memorized only because they were called often, praised often, heard often. By the time the bell rang, the room was full, but the silence that followed wasn't casual. It was tight, watchful. Ms. Tate stepped to the board, her heels making soft, deliberate clicks on the tile. "Today," she began, her voice light but poised, "we'll be discussing classical composition." She wrote the names across the blackboard again. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach. She turned back around, her eyes sweeping over the class. "True musicians," she said, "understand the structure, the intention, the depth behind every note. They don't just play what feels good. They study. They analyze. They don't rely on instinct or catchy little tunes." Her eyes stopped briefly, sharply on Isaiah. He kept his gaze down. His tapping stopped. They don't confuse noise with music. A few quiet snickers broke out in the back row. Not everyone laughed, but enough to twist the air in the room. Isaiah breathed in through his nose. He didn't respond. That's what she wanted? Something to confirm her expectations. "A reaction, a mistake, Mrs." Tate continued. "I don't know if, say, the streets of Atlanta put much value in music theory." This time, the laughter was louder. Isaiah's fists clenched under the desk, fingers curling into his palms. He should have been used to it by now, these little comments. The way she'd never outright say something cruel, but always just enough to make sure the target knew. Just enough to make you shrink. The worst part wasn't her voice. It was the silence that followed. The kids who didn't say anything, the ones who looked away, even the ones who pitied him. Because pity wasn't better than cruelty, it still made him feel small. Mrs. Tate walked slowly to the front of the room, where the chalkboard loomed like a monument. She tapped the edge of the chalk against her palm and turned toward him again. "Carter," she said casually, as if they were in conversation at a dinner party. Isaiah didn't move. She raised her brows. "I assume you don't know much about Beethoven or Mozart, do you?" The question floated in the air. Not meant to be answered, just meant to sting. A few chuckles. A couple of nudges between classmates. Isaiah slowly lifted his head. He looked straight at her. But she wasn't done. "Tell me, Mr. Brooks, if I asked you about some cheap rap songs, I suppose you'd know all those, wouldn't you?" This time, the laughter broke fully open. Even the students who had looked uncomfortable before now shifted in their seats, unsure of whether to join in or stay silent. Isaiah didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just stared at her. Because he knew what she wanted: confirmation. She wanted him to snap, or stumble, or slouch back down. She wanted her assumptions to stay intact. "Well," she said with mock sweetness, "let's test that, shall we? Tell me what notes make up a major third." She tilted her head like a cat pretending curiosity. "The notes?" she repeated. "Surely you've at least memorized that?" Isaiah breathed in deeply. His voice came out calm. "Even?" "That depends on the key," he said. "But in C major, a major third is C and E." The laughter stopped. Some kids looked up. Avery turned slightly in her chair. Logan leaned back. Ms. Tate's expression didn't shift immediately, but something flickered in her eyes just for a second. The kind of flicker that meant he wasn't supposed to know that. She gave a tight smile. "Well," she said, "looks like someone's done some memorizing." "Impressive, I suppose." Then she added, a little too quickly, "Though understanding is different from memorization. Even a broken clock is right twice a day." The laughter that followed was weaker, more hesitant. Some of the students didn't laugh this time. They looked between Isaiah and Ms. Tate. Something about the balance had shifted, but she couldn't let go. Not yet. She stepped forward, chalk still tapping her palm. "I heard your grandfather played piano," she said. Her tone lightened, almost friendly, but the twist underneath was sharp. "So, let's see if talent runs in the family." Isaiah didn't move. "Tomorrow," she continued, "you'll play for us." The room fell silent. "This class has been lacking soul," she added. "Let's see what you can bring." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't an opportunity. It was a challenge. And Isaiah knew exactly what it meant. She didn't want to be impressed. She wanted a show. A failure. Something to prove she was right all along. He sat still. Not because he was afraid, but because he was deciding, and deep inside, he already knew what his answer would be. That night, the piano sat in the corner of the living room like it always had, old, slightly out of tune, the top lid a little warped from years of sun through the window. To anyone else, it looked tired, forgotten. But to Isaiah Brooks, it was something more, It was memory. It was inheritance. It was home. He sat on the worn bench, eyes on the ivory keys, hands resting just above them, not touching. Just listening. From the kitchen, his mother, Naomi, stood quietly with her arms folded, watching him the way she always did when she was worried but didn't want to say it out loud. "You've been staring at those keys for almost an hour," she said softly. Isaiah didn't move. "She wants me to play tomorrow," he said finally. His voice was calm, but there was tension beneath it. Naomi stepped into the light and leaned against the wall. "Ms. Tate?" He nodded. "She thinks it's a joke. She wants me to mess up." Naomi didn't deny it. "Of course she does." Isaiah's jaw tensed. "I don't even know if I should give her the chance," he said. Naomi walked over, sitting on the armrest of the couch beside the piano. She didn't look at the keys. She looked at him. "Your grandfather used to say music was how we answered people who never really heard us." Isaiah said nothing. Naomi reached out and lightly touched the top of his hand. "You're not playing for her, Isaiah, and you're not playing to prove anything to them. You're playing to remind yourself that no one gets to tell you who you are." The room went quiet again. Isaiah closed his eyes, and finally, he played. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with intention. His fingers found the notes, like old friends, drifting from blues progressions to structured arpeggios, moving through rhythm and memory like water through fingers. He wasn't rehearsing for class. He was reconnecting with something bigger than pride. The next morning came with the same gray Georgia sky outside Jefferson Academy's windows. Isaiah entered the classroom to a room full of noise shoes scraping, bags unzipping, light laughter, and low murmurs. But it all fell quiet when Ms. Tate entered. She moved to the front of the classroom with her usual poise, her notebook in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other. She didn't look at Isaiah. Not yet. Instead, she turned to the board and began writing scales C major, a minor, G major, each clean and deliberate. "Today," she said, "we'll begin with some theory, then we'll have a short demonstration." Some students glanced at Isaiah, then back to the front of the room. Ms. Tate called on Avery Morgan first. "What's the relative minor of C major?" she asked. "A minor," Avery answered confidently. "Correct." Next was Logan. "How many sharps in D major?" "2." She nodded. Then, without turning around, she said, "Mr. Brooks, your turn." Isaiah straightened his back slightly. "What's a major third above F?" He paused only for a second. "A," he said. She still didn't face him. "And above B?" "D sharp." Now she turned, just slightly. "And a perfect fifth above G?" "D." Her eyebrows lifted. Not in surprise, in acknowledgement. There was a short silence. Some students looked around. Chase Taylor leaned forward a little in his seat. "Mrs." Tate took a few steps closer to the center of the room. "And what would you call the interval between C and E flat?" "Minor third," Isaiah answered, clear and steady. She turned fully to face him now. "Then tell me, Mr. Brooks," she said, "if you understand intervals so well, what is it that jazz musicians do differently?" Isaiah looked at her without blinking. "They play with tension," he said. "They bend the rules without breaking them. They know the structure and when to stretch it." The room went still. Mrs. Tate stared at him. For a moment, just a moment, the mask slipped. She hadn't expected that. From the side of the room Avery raised her eyebrows slightly. Even Chase stopped chewing on the end of his pen. Ms. Tate smiled. It was tight. Well, she said, that's quite the answer. She walked back to the front of the class. But we'll see what you really know when it comes time to perform. She gestured to the upright piano in the corner, the same one that had been there for years, slightly out of tune, but still proud. Please, she said. Isaiah stood slowly. He felt the eyes on him, the weight of them. But he didn't let it sink in. He walked to the piano and sat down on the worn bench, fingers resting just above the keys. He took a breath, then another. And then softly, he began to play. Not the big finish, not the dramatic start. But something quiet, intentional. A simple melody in C major basic, familiar, but clean. His hands moved with clarity, not flash. The left hand set a steady rhythm. The right added color. Then a shift. He added a bit of syncopation, a jazz phrase. A flourish that danced between what he had learned and what he had felt. The notes built, not to impress. To speak, Ms. Tate didn't move. Neither did the class. When he finished, there was no applause. Not yet. Just a stillness. Ms. Tate's lips pressed into a thin line. She stepped forward. Well, she said, voice controlled. It seems your grandfather did teach you something useful. Isaiah didn't flinch. He stood, calm and unbothered. He looked her in the eye, and though he didn't say a word, the silence between them said everything. This wasn't over. But neither was he. That night, Jefferson Academy emptied out like any other weekday. Lockers clicked shut. Students spilled into buses and cars. Teachers carried briefcases and coffee mugs across the staff parking lot. But in one quiet corner of the school, room 204 sat in stillness, the worn upright piano waiting in the shadows like an unsaid word. Isaiah didn't stay after class that day. He couldn't. He had walked straight home, his backpack heavy, not with books, but with the weight of tomorrow. The moment Miss Tate had said it, he knew. Her voice had been smooth, her expression polite, but underneath, it was clear. This wasn't a request. It was a setup. She had said it with a smile. Since your grandfather was such a talent, let's see if it runs in the family. That wasn't curiosity. That was control. And Isaiah knew the difference. She didn't want a performance. She wanted a spectacle. Something to confirm what she already believed, that a boy like him didn't belong in front of a room full of real students. That talent from the south side of Atlanta was raw, undisciplined, unworthy of classical space. At home, Naomi could feel the tension as soon as he stepped through the door. Isaiah wasn't the type to slam things or throw bags on the floor, but the way he moved, too quiet, too careful, told her more than words. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she reheated the leftover stew from the night before and set a bowl in front of him. He sat down, but barely touched the spoon. "Talk to me," she said gently. Isaiah stared at the table. "She wants me to play tomorrow." Naomi nodded. "I figured. She's waiting for me to mess up, in front of everyone." "And if you don't?" Isaiah looked up. Naomi tilted her head. "What if you don't mess up? What if you play and remind that whole classroom who you are?" Isaiah leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "That's just it. I don't even know if I want to." His voice was steady but heavy. "She doesn't deserve it. They don't deserve it." Naomi sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. "Let me ask you something," she said. "When your grandfather played piano, you think it was always for people who deserved it?" Isaiah didn't answer. He played in places where people barely looked at him. He played for white diners who couldn't pronounce his name. He played in rooms where the applause came late because they didn't expect that sound to come from that man. Naomi's voice was soft, but her eyes were firm. And every time, he played anyway. Isaiah swallowed hard. She continued, "Because the music wasn't for them. It was for him. It was his name. His story. His way of saying, 'You don't get to tell me what I am.'" Isaiah looked down again. The old piano in the living room caught his eye, its wood faded, the keys slightly yellowed, the bench just barely sturdy. He stood up, walked over, and sat down. Naomi stayed at the table. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment, then fell. Slowly, softly, he began to play. Not jazz. Not classical, something in between. The next morning came fast. Isaiah woke before his alarm. He dressed slowly, deliberately, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because today mattered. And he needed to feel it. He packed his lunch, slid his music folder into his backpack, and walked to school without headphones for the first time in weeks. He wanted silence. He needed to hear his own thoughts. Jefferson Academy looked the same on the outside, but to Isaiah, today felt different. He walked into room 204 just before the bell. Some students looked up, others kept talking. But a few, like Logan Bennett, watched him with quiet curiosity. Ms. Tate stood at the front of the room, her arms crossed, her pearl bracelet glinting in the fluorescent light. She smiled. "Mr. Brooks," she said as the bell rang, "I believe you owe us a performance." Isaiah said nothing. He walked to the piano. The room hushed. Even the students who usually whispered through lessons were silent now. The piano looked even older up close. Its wood was scratched, one of the pedals slightly loose. But Isaiah didn't care. He didn't need it to be perfect. He needed it to be his. He sat down, took a breath, and placed his hands on the keys. He didn't look at Miss Tate. He didn't look at the class. He closed his eyes and began. The first chord was rich, full, resonant, not loud but bold. He moved through a slow blues progression in his left hand, the foundation steady and warm. His right hand joined in, dancing lightly above it, offering fragments of melody that felt like conversation. Then, seamlessly, he shifted. From soul to structure, from feeling to form. His fingers climbed through arpeggio screen, deliberate, refined. The room held its breath. There were no wrong notes, only his notes. Music that told a story no textbook ever would. His wrist lifted, his timing slowed. Then quickened. He bent rhythm, stretched tempo, and returned with precision. And by the time he struck the final chord, a slow, minor resolution that hummed into silence, Isaiah Brooks wasn't just a student in the corner seat. He was the room, the air, the truth. He opened his eyes. The room was still. No one clapped yet. Even Miss Tate didn't speak, but something had shifted. They had seen him, not the boy, not the background, but the musician. And nothing she said next could erase that. That afternoon, Isaiah walked home slower than usual. He wasn't dragging his feet, but he wasn't in a hurry either. The Georgia air was warm, thick, with early fall, and the sidewalks were littered with gold-tipped leaves that crackled under his shoes. He passed the barber shop, where men leaned back in chairs, with their heads tilted and their laughter loud. He passed the corner store, the small church with peeling white paint, and the park where little kids chased each other with sticky hands and high-pitched giggles. Everything looked the same, but something inside him had shifted. He had played, and they had listened. Really listened. Not just Miss Tate, not just the students, but himself too. At home, Naomi Brooks was setting the table for dinner. She looked up when Isaiah stepped in through the screen door, one eyebrow already raised. "You good?" she asked gently. Isaiah nodded, hanging his bag on the hook near the door. "I played." Naomi leaned her hip against the kitchen counter. "And?" he shrugged. They were quiet. Mrs. Tate didn't say much. She studied him. "But you said what you needed to say, right?" Isaiah didn't answer right away. He pulled out a chair and sat at the table, his shoulders relaxed, but his fingers twitching slightly, still echoing the memory of the keys. "She wants more," he said. "That wasn't the end of it." Naomi tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "She's not done." I could see it in her face. "She's trying to prove something. She wants to push me until I trip." Naomi poured sweet tea into 2 glasses and brought them to the table. She sat across from him, folding her hands. "She's trying to take your music from you," she said plainly. Isaiah looked up. "Not just your sound," she continued. "She's trying to take the joy out of it. Make it about fear. Make it about performance and not expression." He nodded slowly. "She doesn't want to hear what I play," he murmured. "She just wants to measure it. Grade it. Box it in." Naomi leaned in, her voice calm but clear. "Then don't play for her." Isaiah frowned. "I can't exactly avoid it. That's not what I mean." She tapped a finger lightly against the table. "She thinks this is about showing her something, but it's not. It's about showing you something, about claiming what's yours." Isaiah leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "I don't want to be some story people tell later." "Some example?" Naomi gave him a look. "Isaiah, you already are. Every time you walk into that classroom and sit in that chair, every time you open your mouth or touch those keys, you're telling a story they didn't expect to hear." He was quiet. She stood up, walked around the table, and sat next to him. "Your grandfather used to say that jazz wasn't just music. It was survival. It was how we stitched ourselves together when the world tried to pull us apart." Isaiah smiled faintly. Naomi touched his shoulder. "You're not playing to change her. You're playing to remind yourself that she doesn't get to define you." For a long while, they just sat there, the low hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between them. Later that evening, after dinner and dishes and a short walk down the block to clear his mind, Isaiah returned to the piano. He didn't sit right away. He stood beside it, one hand on the top, eyes on the slightly crooked picture frame of his grandfather on the wall nearby. The old photo showed a younger Derek Brooks, seated at a stage piano with his head tilted slightly back, eyes closed, lost in sound. A blur of saxophones and upright bass players surrounded him, but Derek was the center. Not because of volume, but because of presence. Isaiah lowered himself onto the bench. He didn't warm up with scales or drills. He didn't pull out sheet music. He just placed his fingers on the keys and waited. Then slowly, he let the music come. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed to impress. It was layered, warm, almost meditative. Blues chords laced with classical phrasing, soft arpeggios brushed between moments of stillness. He explored minor progressions like winding roads, paused in dissonance before resolving with care. It felt like breathing. It felt like remembering. And in that moment, he wasn't playing for Ms. Tate. He was playing for the boy who had sat in the back of the room, wondering if his voice would ever matter. He was playing for every glance, every sigh, every time someone had chosen not to say his name out loud. He was playing for his grandfather, for his mother, for himself. When the last chord faded, Isaiah stayed there for a moment, hands resting, shoulders loose, eyes still closed. He didn't need a witness. The music had done its job. And he was ready for whatever came next. That night, long after the dinner dishes had been rinsed and the TV had fallen quiet in the living room, Isaiah returned to the piano. The house was dim. Only the kitchen light cast a warm, golden spill across the floorboards. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a space has been waiting for you to come back and finish something. He sat on the old bench, worn at the edges from years of use, and let his fingers settle gently over the keys. He didn't press down, not yet. In the next room, Naomi leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching in silence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had seen that look in his grandfather's eyes too many times before stillness, before the storm. Isaiah wasn't hesitating. He was listening, feeling. The music was already there. It was just waiting to come out. Finally, he played. At first, it was slow, hesitant, almost. A few loose chords, fingers brushing against melodies he didn't quite catch. But then he found it, the rhythm, the breath. And the notes began to connect. He played low, keeping his left hand steady on the bass line, letting it hum like a heartbeat underneath the melody. The right hand floated above, light and searching, shaping phrases that twisted and turned with emotion. It wasn't a song from any book. It wasn't written down. It was just his born of memory and mood and all the words he hadn't spoken that week. He let the classical scales thread through the soul of jazz, bending structure into feeling. Every note he played was something unspoken. Every chord a refusal. He played until the tension in his shoulders unwound, until the stiffness in his fingers melted. And then he played more, not to prepare, not to perform, but to remember. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't playing to meet Ms. Tate's expectations. He was playing for every time someone looked at him and only saw potential failure. For every moment he'd been reduced to a stereotype. For the uncomfortable silences, the sideways glances, the teachers who asked him if he was in the wrong room. This was his answer. His way of reclaiming his place. Each sound built on the last, a crescendo not of volume, but of presence. And when the final chord faded into the soft hush of night, Isaiah didn't move. He sat there, with his hands still on the keys, breathing steady, the echo of what he had just played still vibrating in his chest. In the doorway, Naomi finally spoke. "I've never heard you play like that before." Isaiah glanced over. "Me neither." "You ready for tomorrow?" He didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly, "because I'm not going in there to prove anything." Naomi smiled. "That's how I know you're ready." The next morning, Isaiah woke before the sun had even peeked through the curtains. He didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel excited either. He just felt steady, like something had clicked into place. He pulled on a clean shirt, combed his hair back neatly, and packed his music folder even though he knew he wouldn't need it. This wasn't going to be about notes on paper. He ate breakfast slowly, and Naomi made sure he had something extra in his bag, a small bottle of water and 2 oatmeal cookies wrapped in a napkin. Not because he asked, but because she always knew when he'd need a little strength between moments. As he stepped outside, she called after him. "Don't shrink," she said. "Even if she tries to make you small, don't give her the satisfaction." Isaiah gave her a look. "I won't." "Play like the room doesn't matter." He nodded and walked into the day. At school, the hallways buzzed with low chatter and squeaking sneakers. Some students said hi. Some didn't. A few looked at him longer than usual, maybe curious, maybe impressed, maybe unsure of what they'd seen the day before. He didn't react. He kept moving. When he reached room 204, he paused outside the door for a moment. He could hear chairs scraping on the floor inside, a few voices, Ms. Tate's footsteps crossing the tile. He walked in. She was already standing at the board, chalk in hand, her back to the class. Students were settling into their seats. Some looked up as he entered. Logan gave a small nod from the second row. Avery Morgan didn't smile, but her eyes followed him with a thoughtful expression. Isaiah sat down in his usual seat, but he wasn't hiding in the corner today. He was waiting. Ms. Tate turned around, her pearl necklace shining under the lights. "Well," she said, her voice as smooth as ever. "Mr. Brooks, since you seemed so prepared yesterday, perhaps you'd care to continue." Isaiah didn't hesitate. He stood. He walked to the piano, quiet but sure, his steps even. And when he sat down, he didn't glance at her. He didn't scan the room. He placed his fingers on the keys, closed his eyes, and let go. The first note that came from the piano was not loud. It was soft, intentional. A deep, rich tone that seemed to settle into the corners of the classroom, wrapping itself around the space like a quiet declaration. Then came the second. Then the third. Isaiah didn't rush. His hands moved with calm purpose, the way a painter might approach a blank canvas with brush in hand, not trying to impress, just trying to speak. The room went still. Even Ms. Tate, who had taken her usual place near the blackboard with her arms crossed, didn't interrupt. Her expression was neutral, almost bored, but her eyes didn't leave him. At first, Isaiah played a blues progression, simple and familiar. His left hand walked the bass line with ease, while his right began to add color-soft, syncopated rhythms that leaned gently into jazz. He let the melody rise slowly, like steam from a cup of coffee on a quiet morning. But then it changed. His fingers shifted, and suddenly the style turned. He was in classical territory now. Scales, arpeggios, ornamentation. But he didn't play it like an exercise. He played it like a conversation. One hand asking questions, the other answering. The two worlds, jazz and classical, merged in his hands. He was no longer following anyone's idea of what music should be. He was building something new. The left hand returned to its swing, rolling through a rich minor pattern, and the right hand danced above it, teasing out fragments of Bach-like precision before slipping into something freer, more fluid, more him. He played without sheet music, without guidance, without hesitation. Every note was deliberate. Every chord was truth. By the time he reached the middle of the piece, the classroom was no longer a classroom. It was a stage, a sanctuary, A place where he wasn't boxed in or talked over or smiled at with pity. He wasn't the black student who could play. He wasn't the kid with a jazz background. He wasn't an exception. He was Isaiah Brooks, a musician, a storyteller. And everyone in the room knew it. Logan Bennett sat 2 rows back, mouth slightly open, watching with a look Isaiah had never seen on him before. Not confusion, not amusement, but awe. Avery Morgan leaned forward, her chin in her hand, her eyes locked on the piano, like she was afraid to blink and miss something. Even Chase Taylor, who had laughed the loudest the day before, was silent now, his pen motionless in his fingers. Isaiah's music rose and fell like breath, sometimes tender, sometimes bold. His chords stretched time, then snapped it back. He bent melody without breaking it, and near the end, when his fingers slowed and the tempo softened, you could hear the sound of a pin dropping, or maybe just the collective heartbeat of a room finally learning how to listen. Then came the final phrase. He returned to the blues, slow, wistful, beautiful. He let the last chord hang in the air, not rushing to lift his hands from the keys, letting the vibration linger, letting silence fill the room. When he finally pulled his fingers away, he didn't move. He sat still, his shoulders relaxed, his breath even. The classroom was frozen. Then quietly, one clap. It came from the middle row, then another, then a few more. And in seconds, the entire room erupted into applause, not the kind that came from obligation, but the kind that came from realization. They weren't clapping for a student who had done surprisingly well. They were clapping for someone who had claimed the room. Ms. Tate remained at the front of the room. She didn't join in. Her arms were still crossed, her chin slightly raised, but something behind her eyes had shifted. She no longer looked amused. She looked unsettled. Isaiah stood slowly, turned to face the class, and gave a small, respectful nod. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The applause faded, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something that hadn't been there before. Respect. Recognition. Isaiah walked back to his seat. No one spoke, no one needed to, even Ms. Tate said nothing, and that silence, it said everything. The room was still ringing from the applause when Isaiah returned to his seat, but the moment he sat down, Ms. Tate stepped forward. Her arms uncrossed slowly, and she picked up a piece of chalk from the ledge under the blackboard. Her smile had returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was that tight-lipped, practiced smile that always meant trouble. "Not bad," she said, her voice calm. "Unexpected, perhaps." Isaiah didn't look at her. He kept his gaze focused ahead, his hands resting loosely on the desk. Ms. Tate turned back toward the board, writing a phrase in neat, confident strokes. Technique over emotion. She spoke again without turning around. "But let's not forget," she said, tapping the chalk against the board, "this is a classical music class, not a jazz lounge." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension was back, creeping in from the corners like fog. "I'm not sure you understand what real discipline sounds like," she added, her tone sharper now. "There's a difference between flair and foundation." She turned to face the room, her gaze falling squarely on Isaiah. The hands that had just played so beautifully now gripped the edges of his desk. He didn't move. Ms. Tate went on. "Improvisation may sound impressive, but without structure, it's meaningless. And that performance? It was clever, I'll give you that. But clever isn't the same as skilled. A few students glanced at one another, unsure what to think. Logan looked from Isaiah to the front of the room, frowning. Even Avery's expression had grown cautious. Isaiah still said nothing, but something inside him had shifted. Again. He had given her everything, his music, his restraint, his focus, and still, it wasn't enough. Still, she twisted it. Still, she stood there and tried to reduce him. He didn't stand right away. He didn't need to. His voice was clear, even, and steady when he spoke. You just don't want to admit that you were wrong. The sentence cut through the room like a snapped string. All movement stopped. Mrs. Tate blinked. I'm sorry, she said. Isaiah stood now. You thought I was going to fail, he said, locking eyes with her. You set me up. You wanted me to fall on my face so you could nod and tell yourself you were right about me. The silence in the room grew thick, dense with disbelief and something else acknowledgement. You never wanted to see what I could do, Isaiah continued. You wanted to confirm what you already believed. Ms. Tate's hand tightened around the chalk. Her jaw tensed. And what exactly do you think I believe? She asked, her voice taut. Isaiah didn't flinch. That someone like me doesn't belong in your classroom, that I'm not good enough, that what I bring to the piano isn't real music, and that I don't deserve to be taken seriously. Someone in the back of the room whispered, Damn. No one laughed. No one interrupted. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He was telling the truth. And I played anyway, he said, not to prove you wrong, but to remind myself that you don't get to decide what I am. Ms. Tate took a step forward. Watch your tone, Mr. Brooks. Isaiah didn't back down. I'm not raising my voice. She narrowed her eyes. You should remember, I'm the teacher here. If I say you're not good enough, then you're not good enough. For a moment, the whole class held its breath. Then Isaiah straightened his shoulders. You can teach music, he said, but you can't teach me who I am. Another beat of silence, then a clap. It came from the back of the room, strong, steady. Not hesitant, then another and another. Logan was clapping. Avery joined him. A few others followed, then most of the class. They weren't cheering, they were affirming. This wasn't just about a piano. This was about being seen. Ms. Tate didn't move. She stared at the board, her lips tight, her hands frozen at her sides. The applause filled the room like Isaiah's music had moments earlier loud, full, unshakable. This time, it wasn't about performance. It was about presence. He had stood his ground, and the room had heard him. When the final bell rang that day, the halls of Jefferson Academy didn't sound the same. There was still the usual shuffle of feet, the low hum of lockers slamming shut, and voices bouncing off the walls. But underneath it all, something had shifted. The kind of shift that didn't come from announcements or memos. The kind of shift that came from truth being spoken in a place where silence had lived too long. Isaiah walked slowly toward his locker, not because he was tired, but because people were watching, not staring. Not gawking, just watching, some with curiosity, some with surprise, some with something that looked a lot like respect. He didn't look down. He didn't hurry. A few students nodded as he passed. One offered a fist bump. Another clapped him lightly on the back. These were kids who had never really noticed him before, not in the way that mattered. Near the water fountain, Logan stepped into his path. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Isaiah, shook his head once and let out a quiet whistle. "I've never seen anyone talk to her like that," he said. Isaiah gave a small smile. "She's not the first person to look down on me." "And she won't be the last," Logan added. Isaiah nodded. "That's all right." They stood there for a moment, in comfortable silence. No fanfare. No speeches, just understanding. Then Logan nudged him with his elbow. "You coming to practice tomorrow?" Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "You play ball now?" Logan laughed. "Nah, I meant band practice." Some of the guys were talking. "You ever think about doing something with this? Like, for real?" Isaiah didn't answer. Not yet, but the idea landed somewhere inside him and stayed. As they walked toward the school exit, a few more students passed them with lingering glances. Not everyone smiled, not everyone clapped, but no one looked at him the same way they had the day before. He wasn't just the kid in the back of the room. He was the kid who had stood up, who had played, who had spoken truth without shouting. And that mattered. At home that evening, Naomi stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing vegetables, when Isaiah stepped through the door. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a second, backpack slung over one shoulder. Naomi turned around slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. "Well?" she asked. Isaiah smiled. "I said what I needed to say." She walked over and pulled him into a quiet hug, one hand resting on the back of his head like she used to when he was little. "I know you did," she whispered. They sat together at the table as the light outside faded to soft pink and the day cooled down. He told her everything, how he played, how the class responded, how Ms. Tate tried to twist it, and how he didn't let her. When he finished, Naomi didn't say anything right away. She just smiled and nodded, her eyes full. "You didn't just play for yourself, Isaiah," she said. "You played for every kid who's ever been told to be quiet, to sit down, to wait their turn." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. The next day, he walked into room 204 like he always did. Tate was already at the front of the room, writing something on the board. She didn't look up when he entered. She didn't call on him during class. She didn't make any small comments or backhanded remarks, and Isaiah didn't need her to. He didn't need her approval anymore. He had something she couldn't give him, and more importantly, something she couldn't take away. Dignity. That afternoon, as class ended and students filtered out, Isaiah stayed behind for a moment. He approached the piano, placed one hand gently on the lid, and looked up at the chalkboard one last time. Ms. Tate glanced in his direction, just briefly. "I'll need the piano next week," she said quietly. Isaiah nodded. "I know." He didn't wait for more. He didn't need more, because that room, once a place that made him feel small, had become a space where he stood tall. And no matter who stepped in tomorrow, no matter what lesson was on the board, the truth had already been played and heard. Outside, the sun warmed the sidewalk as Isaiah stepped out of the building. The air felt lighter, his steps more grounded. And though he didn't know exactly where the music would take him next, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't be playing in the shadows anymore. One of the most powerful lessons from Isaiah Brooks's story is that dignity isn't something granted. It's something we claim by knowing who we are, even when others try to define us. Isaiah faced a classroom where bias was quiet but sharp, where assumptions whispered louder than facts. But instead of shrinking, he chose to speak through his music. And when that wasn't enough, he used his voice to say what had long been ignored. For older Americans, especially those who've endured their own battles with being overlooked or misunderstood, this story strikes a familiar chord. It reminds us that no matter our age or background, there will always be moments where the world questions our worth. In those moments, we can either stay silent or rise calmly and clearly to assert our truth. Isaiah's journey isn't just about a boy in a classroom. It's about all of us reclaiming the right to be seen fully, not through stereotypes or assumptions, but through the richness of who we truly are. In a divided world, that quiet courage may be the most powerful music of all.